The idea of greatness is a fluid one. What does it mean to be great? In the ancient times, it would mean to be a great warrior, or maybe a great politician, maybe somebody who had great landmass. Obviously, Alexander was called Alexander the Great. And I learned this week he actually has the same middle name as Winnie the Pooh. So that's really interesting. I would have never known. But what it means to be great has always changed throughout history. Some would say that greatness meant pure strength. Some would say that greatness meant military prowess, if you could be a great leader of the military. Some would say to be great meant that you had great political power and you could work through intrigue and through different medians to be able to bring together all of these different people. In our modern democracy, some would say being great would be to be a great president, right? You could look at great presidents in our country's history like Abraham Lincoln or George Washington or whoever it might be, and different things in their lives would make them great. The idea of what it meant to be great throughout history has changed quite a bit based on our metrics. But in the kingdom of God, what it means to be great has always been the same. To be great means to be a servant. To be lifted up means that you are a humble person. And Jesus is going to talk about this with his disciples today. And I think it's a very important message for us because we live in a world where many want to achieve greatness. Because in our modern world, one of the signs of greatness is to be famous. Literally, they did a poll with people under the age of 35, and they said, if you could have one thing in this life, what would it be? The number one answer, I want to be famous. I want to be famous. Make me famous. Because if I'm famous, then I can be rich, then I can be well known, I can have notoriety, I can have all of the things that this world tells me I need to have. I want to be famous. Asking school-aged children specifically, I think this was from 6th grade until 12th grade, they asked the same thing, like, what do you think is the best job to have? And where 50 years ago, things like doctor, teacher were at the top of the list, most children responded, I want to be a YouTube influencer. I want to be a YouTube star. That's where the money is. That's where, if I could just be famous on YouTube, that would be it. Our idea of greatness is greatly skewed. And the disciples in this interaction with Jesus had a very skewed view of what it meant to be great as well. But I think as we dig into this and we start to see what Jesus advised them and how Jesus described greatness in his kingdom has great effect on our lives as well. And so if you'll pick up with me, we're going to just start in verse number 30. In verse number 30 we read, and they went on from there and passed through Galilee, and he did not want anyone to know. So if you remember last week, Jesus healed the boy who was possessed by the demon. They had been traveling through, he had been transfigured on the mountain, and now they are continuing to travel down south through Galilee, and as they're traveling down this way, Jesus doesn't want anybody to know. We see this more and more, especially after this linchpin verse that we read with Peter where he said, you are the Christ, the Son of God. After that point, Jesus is now continually working towards God's purpose while having to dodge the religious leaders and those who would pull him away, those who would seek to set him up as king, as happened whenever he fed the 5,000, or those who would seek to draw him away from what his primary purpose was. He is walking through this world fulfilling God's purposes, and that's why we see he didn't want anyone to know. He was there with a specific purpose, that his disciples might understand who he truly was. Because we see in this next verse, they haven't got it yet. And in verse number 31, we read this, and for he was teaching his disciples, saying to them, the Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men, and they will kill him. And when he is killed, after 3 days, he will rise. But they did not understand the saying, and they were afraid to ask him. So I think the reason that they were afraid to ask him about this specifically is because from the end of Mark chapter 8 verse 31 until now, Mark 9:30, so here in this one chapter span, 3 different times Jesus has told them clearly what was going to happen, what his purpose was. He said originally, the Son of Man is going to be rejected by the chief priests and the scribes and the elders. He is going to be tortured and crucified, but he will rise again in 3 days. And Peter said, that's not how this is going to happen, Jesus. No, 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 no. Don't say those kind of things. People are going to stop following you if you say those kind of things. Like, that's not the way this works. And Jesus had to rebuke Peter and say, "Get behind me, Satan." And then Peter, James, and John were on the mountain of transfiguration with him. They literally saw Jesus in his glory, his garments bleached whiter than any bleach on earth could make them. He was radiant in his beauty. And immediately after that, he told them that the Son of Man would be betrayed and he would be killed, but he would rise again. And it said that they did not understand. And now for the third time in this very short period of time, he tells them as clearly as he can, the Son of Man is going to be betrayed and killed, but after 3 days he will rise again. And it said they were afraid to ask him because they didn't understand. So like, he said this 3 times now, guys, and I don't know what kind of metaphor he's trying to make here. I don't know what kind of lesson he's trying to teach us, but he can't really just mean what he's saying. That he's actually going to be betrayed, that he's actually going to be killed, that he's actually going to raise. I mean, none of that makes any sense, so we really don't understand what he is saying, but they were afraid to ask him. And I think this is a perfect example of why we need the gospel preached to us, ourselves preaching it, why we need to read it every day. The gospel is not something that we just get over. It's not something that we learn as a kid at VBS and we're like, great, the gospel, awesome, and now we can move on from that. These disciples, following closely, literally to the incarnate Jesus, walking right beside him day by day, still often missed what he was trying to convey to them. And let me tell you that even if you're saved for 50 years, 60 years, or 70 years, it doesn't matter. The implications of the gospel will far exceed the span of your life. We need the gospel every single day. It's not something we're just like, cool, I got it, Jesus rose from the dead, and now we can move on to the deeper things of theology. It is the cornerstone and the basis. It is the foundation and the fountain from which all of our knowledge of God must be drawn. We never get over the gospel. When life is good, the gospel reminds us that the ultimate good of all human history is the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And when life is falling apart, the gospel reminds us that God in the flesh faced afflictions and rejection and humiliation, and he is with us and understands all of our hardships and our sorrows. When we're walking closely with the Lord, the gospel reminds us that it is only possible because of the reconciliation to God bought by the blood of Jesus Christ. And whenever we feel like we could not possibly be further from God, we are reminded that Christ bore the penalty for every one of our sins, and he shows us the way back to the Father. And so even though here in this short period of time, 3 different times, Jesus has told the story of the gospel that he would be rejected and killed, but rise to ultimate victory, and the disciples didn't get it, it's not something we can ever get over. We might know it, we might believe it in the very deepest parts of ourselves, but we need to be reminded of it constantly. You need to have it preached to you, and you need to preach it to yourself. You need to read it. You need to get it down into your guts where you really know it, where it affects every part of your life. The gospel is not something that we move on from. It is part and parcel of the Christian life. In every victory and in every trial, the truth of the gospel should be a constant companion that cheers us and sobers us, that emboldens us and humbles us to remember the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. So here, as he's walking with his disciples again, for the 3rd time, he tells them, I'm going to be crucified, but I'm going to rise again in 3 days. But again, the disciples had a different idea of what it meant to be great. They had a different idea of what it meant to be the Messiah. They had a different idea of what Jesus was there to do. And so whenever he tells them this, they're like, man, that is a weird saying. He keeps saying that, and I'm sure that there's some deeper meaning that we're not getting there, but he said it 3 times now, so I'm afraid to ask him. So they keep going down the mountain now, continuing on their journey. And in verse number 33, we see that quickly they forget about, hey, I wonder what Jesus meant by that, and they turn to other conversations. And in verse number 33, we read this, "And they came to Capernaum, and when he was in the house, he asked them, 'What were you discussing on the way?' But they kept silent, for on the way they had argued with one another about who was the greatest." So think about that. Jesus is telling them that I am the king of creation, and the king is going to be killed and rejected and rise again in 3 days. And their very next topic of conversation as they're walking down the road is, "Hey, so who do you think's gonna, have the most territory whenever Jesus takes over? Who do you think's gonna have the most prestige whenever, JC gets into power? This is gonna be awesome, right? Like, who's gonna have the biggest mansion? Who's gonna have the most authority? Who's gonna have the best name whenever Jesus comes into his kingdom, whenever he kicks the Roman Empire out, and whenever Jerusalem is set back up as the capital of the world as it should be, and whenever everybody else is cast out and Jesus is shown to be the king, who do you think's gonna have the biggest house?" These are the kind of conversations that they're having right after Jesus has talked about him being the king and a suffering servant. Now their conversations turn to who's going to be the greatest, who's going to have the most, who's going to be the most revered in his kingdom. And if this doesn't show how thoroughly the disciples had been indoctrinated by their culture, I don't know what else would. They had been indoctrinated by the idea that the Messiah who was coming was going to conquer the Romans. He was going to set up the Jewish nation, that Israel would be made great again, and everybody else would bow down to them, that he was going to come with a iron fist and take back the homeland. They were indoctrinated by this idea, and it affected how they understood Jesus' words. And so even whenever he talked about suffering, even whenever he talked about serving, they just didn't seem to get it. That's a constant theme that we've seen here over the last 6 months walking through the book of Mark, these 9 chapters over and over again. It's like, and the disciples didn't get it. And the disciples didn't get it. And they see these great, amazing things happen, but they didn't get it. And even whenever they do get it, and Peter makes this great profession, "You are the Christ," and everyone's like, "Yes, they finally get it." 1 verse later, he's like, "Oh, but yeah, Jesus, we don't like that." They didn't get it because they had been indoctrinated by their culture to believe that greatness, that the Messiah who was coming was all about an earthly kingdom, was all about this earthly setting up and this physical greatness. And that's what they were hoping for, and that's what they placed their faith in. They were so engrossed in the ideas of greatness that shortly after Jesus, for the 3rd time, tells him that he would be tortured and killed, their next topic of conversation is, "I want to be great. Who's better? Who's going to be number one? Who's going to be Jesus' right-hand man?" But Jesus corrects this thinking very quickly in verse number 35. "And he sat down and called the 12, and he said to them, 'If anyone would be first, he must be last of all and servant of all.'" Jesus is again reiterating this idea that the kingdom that he is bringing is completely upside down to what they're expecting. While it's right side up, it's how the world was always meant to be. Their vision of the world is so skewed that it seems upside down. How could you succeed by dying? How could you lead by serving? How could you win by seemingly by all of the world's standards losing? But he brings this in that if you want to be the greatest, you will be a servant. If you want to be first, then you must make yourself last. Charles Spurgeon expressed it this way about the Christian life, and I think it's really good. He says, "The Christian grows rich by his losses. He lives by dying, and he becomes full by being emptied." The Christian life is one that is completely upside down to the way that this world tells us that things are supposed to work. And one thing that makes the Christian life so hard is because it wasn't only the disciples who were indoctrinated by the culture that was around them, but we often are indoctrinated by the culture that's around us too. If we were to ask the question, what does it mean to be great? Would our answer be the same as Jesus's? If I want to be great, I have to be a servant. if I want to be great, if I want to be exalted, if I truly want to be one of the people in the kingdom who God calls great, then I need to humble myself. I need to serve others. I need to sacrifice from those things that I want and follow fully after God. I need to give up my own ambitions in order to follow the call of Christ. Is that how we would define greatness in our lives? Or do we have other definitions? Would we say, absolutely, Jesus is right, being a servant is great, but only to a certain point? Only to the point where it becomes a little bit too uncomfortable, and then not so much. We would say, absolutely, Jesus, yes, the first shall be last, the last shall be first. If I want to be great in your kingdom, I got to be last. Except whenever, I'm late for work and I'm going 20 miles an hour over the speed limit, kind of dodging in between cars because I got to get there on time, right? And I'm not thinking about everybody else, right? But other than, those times where it's inconvenient to think of others before myself, absolutely, Jesus. Yes, I want to be last. Has our idea of greatness, how we think that greatness comes, what we think the definition of greatness is that more influenced by our own thoughts, our own desires in our society, or is it more influenced by the way that Jesus lived his life? Because these aren't just things that Jesus said. Remember, Jesus lived in the perfection of heaven. And I think about that as we sing the song, Holy, 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 that literally it talks about the angels covering their faces because they couldn't even look on God. It tells us in the book of 2 Timothy that God dwells in this inapproachable light. Could you imagine that? That's just your existence of this perfection and glory, of this purity where there is no pain, where there is no suffering, where all is right, and you leave that to live a life in the dirt, to be born to poor parents, to be spit on and mocked, to have to walk everywhere you go. Jesus didn't even have a car. 99% of the time, Jesus didn't have a donkey or a camel that he was riding on. He was walking. The God of the universe getting bunions on his feet and calluses on his hands from having to do the menial labor that many of us would be like, no, I don't really want to do that. This is the life that the Son of God lived, that God himself came down in flesh to live. And so whenever he says that the greatest are those who are servants of all, he is not giving lip service to some great idea, but he is living that definition of greatness. He is embodying all that he says here, and he's trying to get his disciples to understand and to do the same. Because while they're jockeying for position, while they're trying to decide who gets to sit at the right hand and who gets to sit at the left hand, who gets the Malibu beach house and who gets to have all of these great things, Jesus has come down from glory and is living in a fleshly body and is looking towards the cross. And so he's trying to get his disciples to understand this. And he says, no, if you want to be great, you have to be a servant. If you're setting yourself up to be first, you don't get it. You don't get how it works in my kingdom. You have to humble yourself. You have to prefer others above yourself in order that you might be great in my kingdom. And then as Jesus often does, he gives them a perfect practical example of what he's talking about. And we read this in verse number 36. And he took a child and he put him in the midst of them, and taking him in his arms, he said to them, whoever receives one such child in my name receives me, and whoever receives me receives not me, but he who sent me. Now, we have to be careful that we don't just read this as a completely random statement that Jesus made, right? Like, hey, I'm telling you how to be great in my kingdom. Oh, by the way, here's this kid. Okay, now let's get back to something else. Like, this isn't just, this parenthetical thing of like, hey, maybe this was going off here to the side. No, Jesus is now giving them the perfect example of what it means to be great in his kingdom. Because in the ancient Near East, there was nobody who was considered less than a child. They couldn't protect themselves. They couldn't fend for themselves. They had no rights, especially in the Roman era. To be a child was very dangerous. They had specific statutes called the patris familia, and he was the one who was the head of the household. And if at any point, for whatever reason, he became displeased with the child, he could say, put that child on the doorstep. Throw that child in the river. We're done. And even in the ancient Jewish understanding, while theirs was much kinder than the Roman understanding, they did not view children as having rights. They viewed children as people who were supposed to obey fully, people who were supposed to completely focus in on what their parents told them to do. And that was their understanding of children. And so whenever Jesus brought out a child and he said, you need to be like one of these, that would be a hard pill to swallow. Right? You feel like a 4-year-old when you tell them, hey, baby, can you do this? I'm not a baby, I'm a big girl, right? Like that they're like, I want to do this. Like you kind of feel like that, right? Like I'm not a child. I'm not a child. I'm a grown man. I'm a grown woman. I have all these rights and all these different things. And so to act like a child? To blindly obey? No. I have self-will and self-determination, and I should make my own way. But whenever Jesus tells them that they must be like this child that he puts in their midst, they should receive this childlike faith. I think we see multiple things there because we see the Bible has a lot to say specifically about children. And I think these would have been some of the things that would have been rolling around through the minds of the disciples as Jesus was telling them that if you want to be great, here's an example. This child. The first thing that we see all throughout Scripture is that a child must trust their parent because they are fully dependent on their parent. He's saying, if you want to be great in my kingdom, then you need to have a trust and dependency on the Father. Where you're not making your own choices, where you're not chasing after your own will, but instead where you are fully submitted to the Father. We see this as the cry of Solomon in Proverbs 1:8-9, where he says, hear, my son, your father's instructions, and forsake not your mother's teachings, for they are a graceful garland on your head and a pendant on your neck. Again, Solomon telling his son, he's like, listen, I'm your father and I love you, and listen to your mother's counsel and your father's words. Listen to these things because you need them in order to have abundant life. And then we read also in multiple places in the prophets in Isaiah chapter 1, God often refers to Israel whenever they turn from him, whenever they reject him, as rebellious children. In Isaiah 1:2 we read, hear, O heaven, and give ear, O earth, for the Lord has spoken. The children I have reared and brought up, but they have rebelled against me. That often, even though we are supposed to have lives as children, that we are supposed to have faith as children, that Christ calls us that if we want to be great, then we have to trust and depend on God like children. We want to rebel against him. We want our own way. We got that part right as children, right? That you want your own way, right? Like children want things to happen in the way that they want them to happen. That part we got right. But the fully submission part and the part where we fully trust God. And again, Jesus even says this about Jerusalem in Matthew chapter 23. He says, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stone those who are sent to it. How often I would have gathered your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, but you were not willing. Jesus is telling his disciples that you need to be like a child if you want to be great in my kingdom, and that means being fully trusting and fully dependent on God. Right now, you're trusting in your own way. You want your own way. You want to be great in this world. You want to be wealthy and you want to have authority and position. But I'm telling you that the way to greatness is through sacrifice. And that requires full trust in the Lord. We see also over and over again, even from the 10 Commandments, that children are called to honor and obey their parents. And we see this in Deuteronomy 15. Honor your father and mother as the Lord your God commanded you, that your days may be long and that it may go well with you in the land to which the Lord your God is giving you. Jesus is calling the disciples to a life of greatness that comes through submission and trust to God and honor and obedience to his word. Again, they wanted to have it on their own terms, but he's saying it's not about you. It's about fully submitting to God in honor and obedience. And I think the last thing specifically that the disciples needed to learn from being a child was that children received discipline and correction. We see this all throughout in the book of Proverbs. It happens multiple times where it talks about discipline in the book of Proverbs 23 and 13. Both specifically talks about parents disciplining their children, but I think it says it most beautifully in the book of Hebrews, chapter 12, verses 7 through 11. It says, "It is for discipline that you have to endure. For God is treating you as sons. For what son is there whom the Father does not discipline? If you are left without discipline, in which all have participated, then you are an illegitimate child and not son. Besides this, we have earthly fathers who disciplined us, and we respected them for it. Shall we not much more be subject to the Father of spirits and live? For they disciplined us for a short time as it seemed best to them, but he disciplines us for our good, that we may share in his holiness. For the moment, all discipline seems painful rather than pleasant, but later it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it." I could ask probably everybody in this room, who likes to be disciplined? Not one of our number one things, right? And if you were to ask your child, what do you want for Christmas? I guarantee you they're not going to say more discipline, right? It's not something that we ask for. It's not something that we like. But whenever Jesus is talking about being a child, having childlike faith, being great in his kingdom as being like a child, I think one of those things specifically he points to is being somebody who is open to discipline. Being somebody who is ready to be disciplined whenever we get off track. Whenever this world seeks to steal our attentions and our affections and it drives us away from the truth of the gospel, that we are ready to be disciplined and put back on the right track. And the Bible tells us, that's not pleasant. I love that it doesn't pull punches. It's not like everybody loves discipline, right? No. It says that no discipline is pleasant at the time, but it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it. And again, in 1 John chapter 2 that we've been memorizing, it says very clearly, "By this we know that we have come to know him if we keep his commandments." To be great in his kingdom means that we have to have childlike trust in who God is. We have to obey what he calls us to, and we have to be ready to be corrected whenever we get off course. And this is exactly the opposite of what the disciples wanted. They thought with more greatness came less oversight. With more authority means that now you're the one who's telling other people what to do, and you don't have to listen to other people. And that's why they were arguing about it. They were like, "No, I'm going to be the one telling you what to do, Peter. Whenever Jesus places me, I'm going to be his number 2, and you're going to be like number 4 or 5 down there, Peter, and then I get to tell you what to do." "Nah, Bartholomew, listen, you're going to be you might be 11. I mean, Judas, yeah, he's definitely 12, but you're probably going to be 11 down there, right? And then we're going to get to tell you what to do. Our house is going to be..." They're kind of having this banter back and forth. Who's going to be the greatest? Who's going to be the best? We read in other places in Scripture specifically that this was such a kind of consistent theme within the discussion of the disciples that James and John were like, "Hey, Mom, go talk to Jesus for us and make sure that you get that 2-3 spot for us. Yeah, get those spots secured for us. Can you get those locked in? Take him some of your fresh baked cookies over there and try to convince Jesus that we should be number 2 and number 3 in his kingdom." This is obviously something that they thought about a lot. How are we going to be great? How are we going to be exalted? How are we going to have position and status and authority and wealth? And Jesus seeks to teach them. And he grabs this child and he says, "You want to see greatness? You want to see what greatness in the kingdom looks like? I'm not going to point you to Herod, who has ultimate control over Judea. I'm not going to point you to Caesar, who has control over all of the Roman Empire. I'm not going to point you to some magistrate or some judge. I'm not going to point you to some Pharisee who knows all of the religious law. I'm not going to point you to some scribe who has written down all of these words of the law. Instead, I'm going to point you to a child. I'm going to say, if you want to be great, if you want to know what greatness looks like in the kingdom of God, look to a child who is fully dependent, obedient, and ready to be disciplined. That's what greatness looks like in the kingdom of God. Whenever I think about that and then I compare it to my own ideas of greatness, I have to admit that I come up far short. I think that's true in most of our lives, that if we look at our ambitions and what we hope to accomplish, if we were to look at our 5-year plans, how much of that would include being more dependent on Christ? Or is it to have more money in the bank and a better house and to pay off the cars? Nothing wrong with any of those things, but those things seem to dominate our thinking. Whenever we think about advancing in our career, is it, well, if I can just have more people who now report to me, if I could just be my own boss, if I could just do X, Y, or Z, or is it if I could just be more submitted to the will of God? If I would just be more ready to obey God's word, I think that would make me more great. Whenever we think about greatness, do we think about less responsibility, less people being able to tell us what to do, less oversight of our lives and our work? Or do we think about more oversight from God, disciplining us whenever we stray from the path? What does greatness look like in your life? What is your picture of greatness? What are your aspirations that you might achieve that you think will make you great? And do they line up with the Word of God? Again, I don't think it is a coincidence that this interchange, before they started to argue about who is great, was preceded by a presentation of the gospel. That Jesus would be betrayed and killed, laid in the grave, and rise again. He's trying to teach his disciples that the gospel is the pattern for true greatness in his kingdom. If we want to be great, then we need to sacrifice. If we want to be great, then we become servants. If we want to be great, then nothing is off the table that God asks us for. If we want to be great, then we willingly accept the discipline of the Lord, that our lives might be formed into the image of holiness. So what does greatness look like for you? And is it worldly greatness or gospel greatness that you seek? Is it status, position, wealth, money, and authority? Or is it nearness to God, holiness, dependency in Christ? Because we can't pursue both at the same time. We often delude ourselves in thinking like, yeah, we're in this middle ground and I'm kind of getting some of this and some of this, but they are exclusive. And if we pursue Christ, we may indeed find some of those other benefits. We may indeed find advancement and goodness and wealth, and we may not. But if we pursue the world, I guarantee you we're not going to find Christ in it. So where is your heart and what are your affections focused on? And whenever you think about advancement and attainment and greatness, is it a picture of a suffering servant who laid down his life? Or is it more like a Roman emperor who has everything he wants? Jesus said clearly that if you would be great in the kingdom, then you must be last of all and servant of all. And so, Lord, help us that we might achieve these things. Would you pray with me?